The iron gate of Deer Lodge Prison clanged shut behind Mason O'Brien for the last time, and he stood there on the dusty road, breathing air that tasted different than it had for the past 6 years. The Montana sun beat down on his shoulders with an intensity he had forgotten, and he realized he was truly alone now, truly free, and the weight of that freedom felt heavier than any chain he had worn. He was 28 years old, but he felt ancient. The years behind bars for a crime he had committed in a moment of desperate stupidity, stealing horses to pay off his father's debts, had carved lines into his face that made him look older. His dark hair had grown long during his final months inside, and his beard was unkempt. The clothes they had given him upon release hung loose on his frame, and the $10 in his pocket represented everything he owned in the world. Mason started walking south, away from the prison, away from the life he had lost. He had no destination in mind, only the vague idea that he needed to find work, rebuild something from the wreckage of his youth. His family was gone. His father had died 2 years into his sentence, his mother before that. His younger sister had married and moved to California, and her letters had stopped coming after the first year. He understood why. Prison was a stain that spread to everyone it touched. The road stretched empty before him, cutting through the rolling grasslands of Montana Territory. It was July of 1884, and the summer heat shimmered off the earth in waves. He walked for hours, his new boots already raising blisters on his heels until the sun began its descent toward the horizon. That was when he heard it. The sound was faint at first, carried on the hot wind, crying. A woman's voice, raw with fear and grief. Mason stopped in his tracks, his hand instinctively going to his hip where a gun would have hung years ago. He had nothing now, no weapon, no protection. Every instinct told him to keep walking. He was a free man, finally, after 6 years of hell. Getting involved in someone else's trouble was the last thing he needed. He took 3 more steps down the road. The crying came again, more desperate this time, and something in that sound struck a chord deep in his chest. He thought of his sister, of his mother, of every person he had failed to protect in his life. Mason cursed under his breath and turned back, following the sound off the main road toward a cluster of cottonwood trees near a dried creek bed. What he found there made his blood run cold. A wagon lay overturned in the ravine, one wheel still spinning slowly in the air. 2 horses were dead in their traces, their bodies already attracting flies. And sitting on the ground beside the wreckage, her dress torn and dusty, her dark blonde hair falling loose from its pins, was a young woman. She was holding something wrapped in a blanket, rocking back and forth, and the sounds coming from her throat were the sounds of someone whose world had just shattered. "Madam," Mason called out, not wanting to startle her. "Madam, are you hurt?" She looked up at him with eyes the color of a summer sky, red-rimmed and swollen from crying. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with a heart-shaped face and delicate features now streaked with dirt and tears. When she saw him, fear flashed across her expression and she clutched the bundle in her arms tighter. "Stay back," she said, her voice hoarse. "Please just stay back." Mason held up his empty hands. "I am not going to hurt you. I heard you crying from the road. What happened here?" She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because some of the tension left her shoulders. "The axle broke," she said. "We were traveling too fast, trying to reach Miles City before nightfall." The wagon went over and the horses. Her voice broke again and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Is that your baby?" Mason asked gently, nodding toward the bundle. "My nephew," she whispered. "He is only 6 months old. My sister was driving. She—" The woman looked back at the wreckage, and Mason followed her gaze. That was when he saw the arm extending from beneath the overturned wagon bed, pale and unmoving. "God above," he breathed. He scrambled down into the ravine, his tired legs finding new strength. When he reached the wagon, he knew immediately that there was nothing to be done. The woman underneath, who must have been the baby's mother, had died instantly when the wagon rolled. Her neck was at an unnatural angle, her eyes open and staring at nothing. Mason closed those eyes gently and said a quick prayer, though he was not sure he had any right to pray anymore. Then he turned back to the young woman on the ground. "I am sorry," he said. "She is gone." The woman, the aunt, nodded slowly as if she had already known, but hearing it confirmed broke something new inside her. "Beth," she said. "Her name was Beth, Beth Kimball. We were twins." "What is your name?" Mason asked. Bonnie Kimball." She looked down at the baby in her arms, who had started to fuss. "And this is Thomas. We were going to Miles City. Beth's husband was there. He is expecting us." She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "He does not even know his wife is dead." Mason looked around at the empty landscape, at the setting sun, at the dead horses and the overturned wagon. They were at least 10 miles from Miles City, maybe more. Night was coming, and with it would come the cold that followed even the hottest Montana days. And there were wolves out here, and worse. "Can you walk?" he asked Bonnie. She nodded, getting unsteadily to her feet. She swayed slightly, and Mason realized she might be injured after all. "I think so. My ankle hurts, but I can walk." "We need to get moving then. We cannot stay here tonight. If we walk steadily, we might reach Miles City by midnight." He paused, looking back at the body under the wagon. "I am sorry. We cannot take her with us, but I give you my word I will make sure someone comes back for her. She will have a proper burial." Bonnie nodded again, tears streaming silently down her face. She gathered up the baby, adjusting the blanket around him despite the heat. Mason quickly searched the wagon wreckage, finding a canteen of water, still half full, and a small satchel of supplies. There was also a rifle, but the stock had broken in the crash. He took the water and the satchel, then offered his arm to Bonnie. "Lean on me if you need to," he said. She hesitated for just a moment before accepting his support. They climbed up out of the ravine together and started walking south toward Miles City. The baby, Thomas, had settled into an uneasy sleep in Bonnie's arms, occasionally whimpering. For a long time, they walked in silence. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple. Mason kept his pace steady but slow, aware of Bonnie's limp and her exhaustion. He could feel her trembling against his side, whether from shock or grief or both, he could not tell. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming back. I heard your footsteps on the road, walking away, and then they stopped." "Why did you stop?" Mason thought about that question. Why had he stopped? Why had he turned back when everything in his life had taught him to keep his head down, to avoid trouble, to think of himself first? "I do not rightly know," he admitted. "Maybe because I have spent the last 6 years unable to help anyone, including myself. Maybe I just needed to know I still could." 6 years. Bonnie looked up at him, curiosity breaking through her grief for a moment. "Where were you?" "Deer Lodge Prison," Mason said flatly. "Got released this morning. I am a horse thief, Miss Kimball, or I was. I served my time, but that does not change what I did. You should know that in case you want to reconsider accepting my help." He expected her to pull away, to look at him with disgust or fear. Instead, she just nodded slowly. "Everyone has done things they regret," she said. "I do not care about your past. You came back when I needed help. That is what matters." They walked on as darkness fell. The temperature dropped quickly, and Mason could feel Bonnie shivering more violently now. He stopped and pulled off his threadbare jacket, draping it over her shoulders. She started to protest, but he cut her off. "I have been cold before," he said. "I will be fine, just keep the baby warm." The moon rose, nearly full, providing enough light to see by. Mason's feet ached, and his blisters had surely burst by now, but he kept walking. Beside him, Bonnie limped along with determination, never complaining, never asking to rest. The baby woke once, crying, and Bonnie tried to soothe him, but he was hungry, and there was nothing she could do about that. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "A few more miles, I think. We will get there, I promise." "You should not make promises you cannot keep," Bonnie said, but there was no accusation in her tone, only weariness. "I have broken enough promises in my life," Mason replied. "I would like to keep this one." It was past midnight when they finally saw the lights of Miles City in the distance. The town sprawled along the Tongue River, a supply point for the surrounding ranches and a hub for cattlemen. Even at this late hour, there were lights burning in some of the saloons and a few other establishments. Mason and Bonnie stumbled into town like ghosts, covered in dust and barely able to stand. The first person they encountered was a night watchman making his rounds. His eyes widened when he saw them. "Good Lord," the man said. "What happened to you folks?" "Wagon accident," Mason said, his voice rough with thirst despite the water they had shared. "About 10 miles north. There is a body there that needs to be recovered. This woman needs help and the baby needs to be fed." The watchman sprang into action, calling for assistance. Within minutes, they were surrounded by people. Someone took the crying baby from Bonnie's arms, promising to find a wet nurse. Someone else tried to lead Bonnie toward the doctor's office, but she resisted, her eyes wild. "My brother-in-law," she said desperately. "Henry Kimball. We need to find Henry. He needs to know about Beth." "I know Henry," the watchman said grimly. "I will fetch him, but miss, you need to see the doctor first." "I will stay with her," Mason said. He was not sure why he said it, only that the thought of leaving Bonnie alone among strangers felt wrong. She had trusted him, leaned on him for miles, and he felt responsible for seeing her through this. The doctor, an older man with kind eyes and gentle hands, examined Bonnie in his small office while Mason waited outside. When he emerged, he shook his head. "She has a badly sprained ankle, lots of bruises, and she is in shock. She needs rest and fluids." "That young woman has been through hell tonight." "Will she be all right?" Mason asked. "Physically, yes. Emotionally," the doctor shrugged. "That is harder to say. Losing a twin sister like that suddenly and violently, that is the kind of wound that takes a long time to heal if it ever does." Before Mason could respond, a commotion erupted down the street. A man came running, his shirt half-buttoned, his hair wild. He was tall and broad-shouldered with a thick mustache and frantic eyes. "Where is she?" he was shouting. "Where is my wife? Where is Beth?" The watchman tried to intercept him, but the man, Henry Kimball, pushed past. He burst into the doctor's office and Mason followed. Henry's eyes locked on Bonnie, sitting on the examination table with her ankle wrapped, and confusion crossed his face. "Bonnie, where is Beth? Where is my son?" Bonnie's face crumpled. "Henry, I am so sorry. The wagon crashed. Beth, she did not make it. She died instantly. She did not suffer." Mason watched as Henry Kimball's world ended. The big man's legs seemed to give out and he collapsed to his knees, a terrible sound tearing from his throat. It was not crying, not yet. It was something more primal, the sound of a man whose heart had just been ripped from his chest. Bonnie slid off the examination table despite her injured ankle and went to him, wrapping her arms around her brother-in-law as he finally broke into sobs. They clung to each other, two people drowning in grief while Mason and the doctor stood by helplessly, Eventually, someone mentioned the baby and Henry's head snapped up. Is Thomas hurt?" "He is fine," Bonnie assured him quickly. "Not a scratch on him. They found a wet nurse to feed him. He is being cared for." Some of the agony left Henry's face, replaced by relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Thank God," he whispered. "Thank God." The rest of the night passed in a blur. Henry went to see his son, and arrangements were made to recover Beth's body from the crash site at first light. The watchman found Mason a room at one of the cheaper boarding houses, paid for by Henry Kimball, who had insisted, despite his grief, that Mason be properly compensated for saving his sister-in-law and son. Mason lay on the narrow bed in his room, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. His body was exhausted beyond measure, but his mind would not quiet. He kept seeing Bonnie's face, the way she had looked at him with those blue eyes full of pain and gratitude. He kept thinking about how close he had come to walking away, to leaving her there alone in the wilderness with a dead sister and a baby who would not have survived the night. When dawn came, Mason was still awake. He washed his face in the basin on the dresser and went downstairs. The boarding house owner, a plump woman with shrewd eyes, looked him over. "You are the one who helped that poor girl last night," she said. "It was not a question. News travels fast in Miles City. That was a good thing you did." "I just did what anyone would have done," Mason said uncomfortably. "No," the woman said firmly. "Most men would have kept walking, especially a man fresh out of Deer Lodge with nothing to his name and every reason to avoid trouble." She saw his surprise and smiled. "Like I said, news travels fast. Now sit down and eat. You look like you have not had a decent meal in years." She was not wrong about that. The breakfast she served him, eggs and bacon and fresh bread with butter, was the best thing Mason had tasted in longer than he could remember. He was finishing his second helping when Henry Kimball entered the boarding house, his face haggard and drawn but composed. "Mr. O'Brien," Henry said, sitting down across from Mason without waiting for an invitation. "I need to thank you properly. If you had not found Bonnie and Thomas, if you had not brought them here safely, I would have lost everything. You gave me back my son. There are not words enough to thank you for that." Mason shifted uncomfortably. "You do not need to thank me. I am just glad I could help." "I am a rancher," Henry continued. "I run a decent-sized operation about 5 miles outside of town. I need hands, especially now. I need men I can trust. I am offering you a job, Mr. O'Brien. Room and board plus $30 a month. It is honest work, hard work, but I think you might be looking for exactly that kind of fresh start." Mason stared at him. $30 a month was fair wages for a ranch hand, better than fair really. And Henry Kimball was offering it to an ex-convict, a horse thief, without hesitation. "Why?" Mason asked. "You do not know me. You do not know what kind of man I am." "I know you came back when you heard someone crying," Henry said simply. "I know you walked 10 miles in the dark to bring my family to safety. That tells me everything I need to know. What do you say?" Mason thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "I accept. Thank you, Mr. Kimball," Henry, the rancher, corrected. "And you will start in a few days. I have to make arrangements first for Beth." His voice caught on his wife's name, but he pushed through. "The funeral will be tomorrow. I would like you to attend if you are willing. Bonnie asked for you specifically." "Of course," Mason said, surprised that Bonnie had thought of him at all in the midst of her grief. The funeral was held the next afternoon in the small church at the edge of Miles City. It was a simple ceremony, attended by Henry's ranch hands, some townspeople who had known Beth and Bonnie. Mason stood at the back, feeling out of place in his prison-issue clothes, the only clothes he owned. He watched as Bonnie sat in the front pew, holding baby Thomas, her face pale but dry-eyed. She had cried herself out, or perhaps she was simply too numb to cry anymore. She wore a black dress that someone had lent her, and her hair was pinned up properly now, though a few golden strands had escaped to frame her face. After the service, as Beth's coffin was lowered into the ground, Bonnie finally broke. Mason saw her shoulders shaking, saw her bend over the baby in her arms as if trying to protect him from the reality of what was happening. Henry was beside her, his own grief written in every line of his body, but he put his arm around her, and they held each other up. When it was over, when the mourners had dispersed, and the gravediggers had finished their work, Mason found Bonnie standing by the grave alone. Thomas was presumably with the wet nurse Henry had hired. Bonnie was staring at the fresh mound of earth, at the simple wooden cross that bore her twin sister's name. "Beth and I were born together," Bonnie said without looking at Mason. "We came into this world holding hands, my mother used to tell us. We did everything together our whole lives. We married men who were friends with each other. We planned to raise our children together, and now she is gone, and I do not know who I am without her." Mason did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He just stood beside her, a quiet presence in her storm of grief. After a long moment, Bonnie turned to him. "Henry told me he offered you a job at his ranch." "He did. I accepted." "Good." She managed a small, sad smile. "I am glad you will be nearby. Is that strange? I barely know you, but I feel like you are the only person who understands what happened out there. You saw it. You were there." "It is not strange," Mason assured her. "Shared tragedy has a way of binding people together." "Will you walk me back to Henry's house?" Bonnie asked. "I am staying there, helping with Thomas until Henry can figure out what to do. He cannot run a ranch and care for an infant alone." "Of course." They walked slowly through Miles City, neither of them speaking much. The town was bustling with afternoon activity, cowboys and merchants and families going about their business. Life continued, indifferent to personal tragedy. Mason wondered if he would ever get used to being around so many people again after years of prison routine. Henry's house in town was modest but well kept, a wooden structure with a small porch and a yard that needed tending. Inside, the wet nurse, an older Mexican woman named Rosa, was feeding Thomas. Bonnie thanked her and took the baby, settling into a rocking chair with a practiced ease that surprised Mason. "You are good with him," he observed. "Beth and I used to joke that we could read each other's thoughts," Bonnie said, looking down at Thomas with such tenderness it made Mason's chest ache. "We could not, of course, but we were so close that it felt like we could. When Thomas was born, I was there. I was the first person besides the midwife and Beth to hold him. He feels like part of me, part of her. Caring for him, it is the only thing keeping me sane right now." Henry arrived home a short while later, looking exhausted. He thanked Mason for escorting Bonnie and reminded him to come out to the ranch in 2 days to start work. Mason agreed and left, walking back to his boarding house as the sun began to set. That night, lying in bed again, Mason thought about the strange turn his life had taken. 2 days ago, he had been a prisoner with no future. Now he had a job, a place to stay, and something he had not felt in years: purpose. The image of Bonnie Kimball with that baby in her arms, the sadness in her eyes mixed with determination and love, lingered in his mind as he finally drifted off to sleep. 2 days later, Mason rode out to Henry's ranch in a wagon with a couple of other new hires. The spread was impressive, with several thousand acres of grazing land, a large barn, a bunkhouse for the hands, and a main house that was bigger and better appointed than the house in town. This was where Beth and Henry had planned to raise their family. The foreman, a grizzled old cowboy named Jack Fletcher, put Mason to work immediately. The days fell into a rhythm of hard physical labor, mending fences, herding cattle, breaking horses, mucking stalls. It was exhausting work, but Mason threw himself into it with a fierce dedication. He wanted to prove to Henry that he had made the right choice. More than that, he wanted to prove to himself that he was more than his past mistakes. Bonnie and Thomas had moved out to the ranch as well. Bonnie had taken over the household duties, cooking and cleaning and caring for the baby. Mason saw her often, usually at meal times when the ranch hands ate at the long table in the main house's kitchen. She always greeted him with a smile, a real smile that reached her eyes, and asked how he was adjusting to ranch life. "It is hard work," Mason admitted one evening after a particularly grueling day of rounding up strays. "But good work. Honest work. I like knowing that at the end of the day I have accomplished something real." "Henry says you are his best worker," Bonnie said, ladling stew into bowls for the men. "He says you are up before dawn and the last one to quit at night." Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I have 6 years to make up for." Over the following weeks, Mason found himself looking forward to those meal times more than he should. Bonnie had a quick wit and a sharp intelligence that she was not afraid to show. She told stories about growing up with Beth, about their adventures and misadventures on their parents' farm in Nebraska. The stories were bittersweet, making her laugh and cry sometimes in the same breath, but Mason could tell that talking about her sister helped. He also noticed that Thomas had begun to recognize him. The baby would gurgle and wave his little arms when Mason came near, and once, Thomas grabbed Mason's finger with his tiny hand and held on with surprising strength. Mason felt something shift inside him at that moment, some long frozen part of his heart beginning to thaw. It was a Sunday in late August when things changed between Mason and Bonnie. Sunday was the ranch hand's day off, and most of the men rode into Miles City to drink and gamble and visit the sporting houses. Mason had no interest in any of that. He had seen where drinking led, had lived through the consequences of poor choices. Instead, he spent his free time reading or walking the ranch's extensive property, relearning how to be alone with his thoughts in a space larger than a cell. He was sitting by the creek that ran through the ranch's north pasture, watching the water slide over smooth stones, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Bonnie approaching, wearing a simple cotton dress and carrying a basket. "I thought I might find you out here," she said. "Henry told me you like to walk on Sundays. I made too many sandwiches. Would you like some company?" Mason wanted to say no. He could feel something growing between them, something dangerous and complicated, and he knew he should keep his distance. She was grieving, vulnerable. She was his employer's sister-in-law, living under Henry's protection. Mason was an ex-convict with nothing to offer. Getting close to her would be foolish, selfish. "I would like that," he heard himself say. Bonnie spread a blanket on the grass near the creek and unpacked the basket. There were sandwiches, cold chicken, fresh bread, and a jar of lemonade. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the water and the birds and the wind in the cottonwoods. "Can I ask you something?" Bonnie said finally. "About prison. You do not have to answer if you do not want to." "Ask," Mason said. "What was it like? Not knowing when you would be free, having every day be the same as the last." Mason thought about how to answer that. "It was like being buried alive," he said slowly. "Like being a ghost, invisible and powerless. Time moves differently when you cannot control any aspect of your life. Days blur together. You forget what it feels like to make a choice, even a simple one like what to eat or when to sleep. The hardest part was not the hard labor or the bad food or even the violence. It was the loss of self." After a while, you start to forget who you were before. You become just a number, a body that moves where it is told and does what it is ordered to do. Bonnie was quiet, absorbing this. How did you survive it? I do not know that I did, not really. The man who went into that prison is not the same man who came out. Maybe that is for the best. That man was reckless and stupid. He made terrible choices. I would like to think I have learned from that. You have, Bonnie said with certainty. The man who came back when he heard me crying, who walked miles in the dark to save Thomas and me, that man is good. I do not care what he did 6 years ago. You should care, Mason said, turning to look at her. Bonnie, I stole horses. I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway because I was desperate and foolish. Good men do not do that. Good men make mistakes, Bonnie countered. They learn from them and try to do better. That is what you are doing. She hesitated, then reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the blanket. Mason, you saved my life. You gave me a reason to keep going when all I wanted to do was lie down in that ravine and die beside my sister. Do you understand that? You turned back. You could have kept walking, started your new life without complications, but you turned back. That is who you are. Her hand was warm on his, and Mason knew he should pull away. He did not. Instead, he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. They sat there by the creek, holding hands like children, and something passed between them that could not be taken back. Bonnie, Mason said, his voice rough. I do not have anything to offer you. I am a ranch hand with $10 to my name and a criminal record. You deserve better than that. Maybe I do not want better, Bonnie said. Maybe I just want someone who sees me, who understands what I have lost and does not try to tell me it will be all right or that I should move on. You do not do that. You just sit with me in my grief and let me feel it. Is that what this is? Mason asked, grief finding companionship and shared understanding. I do not know what this is, Bonnie admitted. All I know is that when I am with you, I feel less alone. Is that enough for now? Mason thought about that, about whether it was fair to her or to himself to pursue something that felt so impossible. But then he looked at her face, at the hope mingled with sadness in her blue eyes, and he could not bring himself to say no. It is enough, he agreed. They spent the rest of the afternoon by the creek, talking about everything and nothing. Bonnie told him about her dreams of becoming a teacher before her parents died and left the farm to her uncle. Mason told her about his childhood, about growing up the son of a blacksmith who drank too much and a mother who tried to hold everything together until she could not anymore. As the sun began to set, they walked back to the main house together. Henry was on the porch, smoking his pipe and watching Thomas, who was playing on a blanket with wooden blocks that one of the ranch hands had carved for him. The baby had grown in the past month, becoming more alert and active. There you two are, Henry said, his tone carefully neutral. I was beginning to think you had gotten lost. Just needed some air, Bonnie said lightly, though Mason could hear the slight tension in her voice. She was wondering if Henry had noticed the change between them, if he would object. If Henry did notice, he said nothing. Over the following weeks, Mason and Bonnie continued to spend their free time together. It became an unspoken routine. On Sundays, they would find some quiet spot on the ranch and simply be together. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. Mason taught Bonnie how to skip stones across the creek. Bonnie taught Mason a silly song her mother used to sing. Slowly, carefully, they learned each other. Mason discovered that Bonnie had a terrible singing voice but loved to sing anyway, that she was afraid of spiders but not of snakes, that she could recite poetry from memory, and often did when she was nervous. Bonnie learned that Mason had wanted to be a horse trainer before his arrest, that his dream had been to run his own stable. That he felt guilty not just about the crime he had committed, but about the way his imprisonment had affected his family. That he had nightmares sometimes about being back in his cell. It was after one of those nightmares in late September that everything came to a head. Mason woke in the bunkhouse in the middle of the night, his heart racing, the walls closing in. He stumbled outside, desperate for air, for space, for anything to prove he was not back in that cell. He sat on the steps of the bunkhouse, his head in his hands, trying to calm his breathing. Mason. He looked up to see Bonnie hurrying across the yard from the main house, a shawl wrapped around her nightgown. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I could not sleep. I saw you from the window." She sat down beside him on the steps. "Another nightmare." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Bonnie took his hand, the gesture so natural now, so familiar. "Tell me about it." "It is always the same," Mason said after a moment. "I am back in my cell, but I cannot remember how I got there. I am trying to remember what I did, what crime sent me back, but I cannot. And I realize that I am going to be there forever this time. That I will never see the sun again, never feel the wind, never." He trailed off. "Never what?" Bonnie prompted gently. "Never see you again," Mason admitted. "That is the worst part of the dream now, knowing I will never see you again." Bonnie's hand tightened on his. "Mason, look at me." When he did, she continued, "You are not going back there. You have served your time. You have paid for your mistake, and I am right here. I am not going anywhere." "Bonnie, we need to talk about this, about us. It has been 2 months since Beth died. You are still grieving. I do not want to take advantage of that." "You are not taking advantage," Bonnie said firmly. "I am grieving, yes, I will be grieving for a long time. But that does not mean I cannot feel other things too. It does not mean I cannot care about you." "Do you?" Mason asked. "Care about me?" "I think you know I do," Bonnie said softly. "I think I have since that first night when you came back for me. Maybe that makes me foolish. Maybe it is too soon. But I am tired of denying what I feel. Life is too short, Mason. Beth died instantly, without warning, without getting to say goodbye to the people she loved. That taught me something. It taught me not to waste time, not to hide from my feelings because they are inconvenient or complicated." Mason looked at her, this woman who had been through hell, and somehow emerged with her courage intact. "I care about you too," he said. "More than I should, more than is probably wise. But Bonnie, I have nothing to give you. I am trying to build a life from nothing. It could be years before I have enough saved to even think about things like marriage or a home of my own." "I do not care about that," Bonnie said. "I do not need grand gestures or wealth or security. I just need honesty. I need someone who will not treat me like I am fragile, who will not try to fix my grief but will just walk beside me through it. You do that. You see me as I am, broken pieces and all, and you do not try to change me." "You are not broken," Mason said fiercely. "You are the strongest person I have ever met." Bonnie laughed, a real laugh, and it was such a beautiful sound that Mason felt his chest tighten. "I am not strong. I am barely holding myself together, but with you, I feel like maybe I do not have to hold it all together. Maybe I can just be." They sat there on the bunkhouse steps as the night deepened around them, hands intertwined, neither of them wanting to break the moment. Finally, Bonnie shivered in the cool air, and Mason insisted she go back inside before she caught cold. "Will you be all right?" she asked, standing up reluctantly. "I will be fine. Thank you for sitting with me." "Always," Bonnie said, and the weight of that promise hung in the air between them. The next morning at breakfast, Henry cleared his throat and addressed the table of ranch hands. "I have an announcement," he said. "I am going to be hiring a housekeeper and a proper nanny for Thomas. Bonnie has been invaluable these past months, but it is time she started thinking about her own future." Mason saw Bonnie's head snap up, surprise and something else, maybe hurt, crossing her face. "Henry, I do not mind helping with Thomas. I love taking care of him." "I know you do," Henry said gently, "and you can still see him as much as you want. But Bonnie, you cannot spend your life being a substitute mother to your nephew. You are 23 years old. You should be thinking about your own family, your own life." "What if I do not want my own life?" Bonnie asked quietly. "What if taking care of Thomas is what gives my life meaning right now?" "Then you can continue to help," Henry said patiently. "But you need to also start considering your options. I received a letter from your uncle in Nebraska. He thinks you should come back to the farm, live with him and his wife. He has several suitable men he would like to introduce you to." "No." Bonnie's voice was flat, final. "I am not going back to Nebraska, and I am certainly not letting Uncle Robert choose a husband for me like I am some prize mare at auction." Henry sighed. "I thought you might say that. Then what do you want, Bonnie? You cannot stay here indefinitely, living in limbo." Bonnie's eyes flicked to Mason, just for a second, but it was enough. Henry caught it, and Mason saw understanding and something else, maybe resignation, cross the rancher's face. "I see," Henry said slowly. "Well, we will discuss this later in private." The rest of breakfast was tense and awkward. As soon as it was done, the ranch hands scattered to their duties. Mason was about to follow when Henry called him back. "O'Brien, a word, please, in my office." Mason's stomach sank, but he followed Henry into the small room off the main hall that served as the ranch's office. Henry closed the door and gestured for Mason to sit. Instead of going behind his desk, Henry leaned against it, arms crossed, studying Mason with an unreadable expression. "How long?" Henry asked finally. "Sir, how long have you and Bonnie been involved?" Mason considered lying, but what was the point? "We are not involved exactly. We are friends. We spend time together, that is all." "Is it?" Henry asked. "Because the way she looked at you at breakfast, that was not how a woman looks at a friend." Mason said nothing. What could he say? Henry ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking very tired. "Look, O'Brien, you saved Bonnie's life. You saved my son's life. I owe you more than I can ever repay. You are also a good worker, reliable, honest. I like you. But I love Bonnie like a sister. She is family. And I will not stand by and watch her ruin her reputation or her future by getting tangled up with a man who cannot offer her anything." The word stung, even though Mason had thought the same things himself. "I understand," he said stiffly. "I will keep my distance from Miss Kimball." "Will you?" Henry asked. "Can you? Because I saw the way you looked at her too, Mason. And I am not sure either of you is capable of staying away from the other at this point." "Then what do you want me to do?" Mason asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "I want you to think carefully about what you are doing," Henry said. "If you care about Bonnie, really care about her, then you need to consider what is best for her. She has been through hell. She is grieving and vulnerable. If you pursue something with her now while she is in this state and it does not work out, you could destroy her. Is that what you want?" "Of course not," Mason said, stung. "I would never hurt her. Not intentionally, maybe, but life has a way of hurting people even when we do not mean for it to." Henry sighed again. "I am not forbidding you from seeing her. I do not have that right, and Bonnie would never forgive me if I tried. But I am asking you, man to man, to be sure of your intentions before you take this any further. If you are just looking for companionship, for someone to ease your loneliness after prison, then walk away now. But if you are serious about her, if you can imagine a real future together, then you need to start thinking about how to make that future possible." Mason sat with that for a long moment. "What if I do not know yet?" he asked honestly. "What if I care about her deeply, but I am not sure if that is enough? I have spent 6 years in prison, Henry. I barely know how to be a free man, let alone how to be someone's partner." "Then you need to figure it out," Henry said bluntly. "And you need to do it soon, before Bonnie gets hurt any worse than she already is." Mason left the office feeling like he had been punched in the gut. Henry was right, of course. Everything he had said was right. Mason was being selfish, letting things develop with Bonnie when he had no clear idea of where they could go. He was an ex-convict with no savings and no prospects beyond his job as a ranch hand. What kind of life could he offer her? He threw himself into his work for the rest of the day, trying not to think about Bonnie, about the way she laughed, or the way her hand felt in his. He stayed out with the herd until well after dark, volunteering for the night watch even though it was not his turn. Anything to avoid going back to the ranch house, to avoid seeing her. But when he finally did return, exhausted and covered in dust, Bonnie was waiting on the porch. Thomas was asleep in her arms, and she was rocking slowly in one of the chairs, humming softly. "You are avoiding me," she said without preamble when Mason approached. "Bonnie, it is late. You should be inside." "Henry talked to you, did not he, about us?" Mason sank down onto the porch steps, too tired to lie. "He did. He is concerned about you, about us." "He has no right to be," Bonnie said, though her voice lacked heat. "I am a grown woman. I can make my own choices." "Can you?" Mason asked gently. "Bonnie, be honest with yourself. 2 months ago, your world fell apart. You lost your twin sister, the person you were closest to in the world. You are caring for her child, living in her house, surrounded by reminders of what you lost. And I came into your life at that exact moment, offering understanding and companionship. But is that real? Or is it just grief and circumstances pulling us together?" Bonnie was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I have been asking myself the same questions," she admitted, "wondering if what I feel for you is real or just me looking for anything to hold on to, and you know what conclusion I came to. What? It does not matter." At Mason's surprised look, she continued, "I mean it. Whether this started because of grief or circumstance or fate, it does not change how I feel now. I care about you, Mason O'Brien. I think about you constantly. When something good happens, you are the first person I want to tell. When I am sad, you are the person I want to be near. Maybe that started because of the accident, because you were there when I needed someone, but it has grown into something more, something real." Mason felt his resolve crumbling. "Henry thinks I cannot give you the life you deserve." "What life do I deserve?" Bonnie challenged. "I am an orphan with no money, no property, living on my brother-in-law's charity. I am not some society belle with dozens of suitors. I am just me, broken and grieving and trying to figure out how to keep living when half of me is buried in that graveyard. You understand that? You see me, not some idealized version of who I should be. That is worth more to me than any amount of money or security." "You deserve more than a ranch hand with a criminal record," Mason said stubbornly. "Then become more," Bonnie said simply. "You told me you used to dream of training horses, of having your own stable. Why can you not do that? You are good with animals. Jack says you have a gift for breaking the difficult horses, that they respond to you in ways they do not with anyone else. Why not build on that?" "Because dreams like that take money," Mason said. "It would take years to save enough to start my own operation." "Then we wait," Bonnie said. "Mason, I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I am not asking for promises you cannot keep. I am just asking you not to walk away from something good because you are afraid, or because Henry thinks it is too soon, or because you do not believe you deserve happiness. Can you do that?" Mason looked up at her, at the moonlight catching in her hair, at the sleeping baby in her arms, at the determination in her eyes. And he realized that he could not walk away. He did not want to. For the first time since leaving prison, he wanted something more than just to survive. He wanted a future, and he wanted her in it. "Yes," he said, "I can do that." Bonnie smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "Good. Now come inside and have some dinner. You missed supper, and I saved you a plate." As summer turned to fall and fall to winter, Mason and Bonnie continued to grow closer. They were discreet, aware of Henry's concerns and the ranch hand's gossip, but they no longer tried to hide their feelings. Henry, true to his word, did not interfere. He hired a housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, and a young woman named Annie to help with Thomas during the day, which freed Bonnie to pursue other interests. She started teaching, offering lessons to the ranch hands who had never learned to read and write. 3 of the younger cowboys took her up on it, and Mason would often find them in the evening, gathered around the kitchen table, laboriously copying letters while Bonnie patiently corrected their work. Mason began to seriously pursue his dream of becoming a horse trainer. He asked Henry's permission to work with the ranch's more difficult horses, the ones that bucked and bit and refused to be broken by conventional methods. Henry agreed, curious to see what Mason could do. What Mason did was patient, gentle work that focused on building trust rather than breaking spirit. It took longer than the usual methods, but the results were remarkable. Horses that had been considered dangerous became calm and responsive under Mason's care. Word began to spread. Other ranchers in the area heard about the ex-convict who had a way with horses and started bringing their problem animals to Henry's ranch, paying good money for Mason to work his magic. Henry took a small percentage for the use of his facilities, but the rest went to Mason. For the first time in his life, Mason began to accumulate real savings. Winter in Montana was harsh, and the work was hard. There were blizzards that left the ranch isolated for days, cattle that had to be rescued from snowdrifts, pipes that froze and burst. But there were also moments of beauty and joy. There was Christmas, when Bonnie cooked an elaborate dinner and they all exchanged small gifts. Mason gave Bonnie a book of poetry he had ordered from a catalog, and she gave him a new pair of leather gloves she had sewn herself. There was New Year's Eve, when they sat by the fire after everyone else had gone to bed, talking about their hopes for 1885. "What do you want, Mason?" Bonnie asked him that night. "If you could have anything in the world, what would it be?" Mason thought about that. 6 months ago, he would have said freedom, a job, a place to sleep. Now his dreams had expanded. "I want my own place," he said slowly. "Not a big operation, just enough land for a stable and a training paddock. I want to work with horses, teach them, help people understand them better. I want to build something that is mine, that no one can take away from me." He paused, then added, "And I want you there. I want to build that life with you." Bonnie's eyes shimmered with tears, but she was smiling. "That is what I want too. I am not there yet," Mason warned. "I have saved almost $100, but that is not nearly enough. It could be another year or more before I can afford to buy land and build a stable." "Then we wait," Bonnie said, echoing her words from months before. "I am not going anywhere." But life, Mason had learned, rarely went according to plan. In February, Henry sat them both down with news that changed everything. "I have made a decision," he said. "I am going to sell the ranch." Mason and Bonnie stared at him in shock. "What?" Bonnie asked. "Henry, why?" "This ranch was your and Beth's dream." "It was," Henry agreed, his voice heavy. "But Beth is gone, and every day I am here I see her ghost. I see her in the kitchen, in the bedroom, in the yard where she used to hang laundry. I cannot move forward while I am living in the past." He looked at Thomas, now almost a year old and beginning to take his first wobbly steps. "My boy deserves a father who is present, not one who is drowning in memories. I have been offered a foreman position on a ranch in Wyoming. It is good money and it comes with a house, a fresh start. When? Mason asked, his mind racing through the implications. The sale will be final in April. The new owner is planning to run cattle, so he will need hands. He might keep some of you on, but I cannot guarantee it. After Henry left the room, Mason and Bonnie sat in stunned silence. Finally, Bonnie spoke. "What are we going to do?" "I do not know," Mason admitted. "If the new owner does not keep me on, I will need to find another job. All the money I have been saving, I was planning to use to buy land eventually, but I do not have nearly enough yet." "How much do you have?" Bonnie asked. "About $200 now, with the extra I have been making from training horses." Bonnie bit her lip, thinking, "Henry is going to give me some money, part of my inheritance from Beth. He told me that when I decide what I want to do with my life, he will make sure I have the means to do it. Maybe together we would have enough to at least make a start." "Bonnie, I cannot take your money." "It is not taking if I am offering," Bonnie countered. "Mason, you just told me you want to build a life with me. Let me help build it. Let me be a partner, not just someone you are trying to provide for." Mason wrestled with his pride, with his ingrained belief that a man should support his woman, not the other way around. But he was learning that life did not always fit into neat categories, that sometimes love meant accepting help, accepting vulnerability. "All right," he said finally. "If Henry approves, if he is willing to release your inheritance, then yes, we will pool our resources and see what we can do." Henry did approve, after a long conversation with Mason about his intentions toward Bonnie. "I want to marry her," Mason told him plainly. "As soon as I can offer her a decent home and a stable life. I am not asking for your permission, but I would like your blessing." Henry studied him for a long moment. "You have changed a lot since last July," he said finally. "When I first met you, you were a man trying to outrun his past, trying to prove he deserved a second chance. Now you are a man building a future. That is what Bonnie needs. That is what she deserves." He held out his hand. "You have my blessing, Mason, and my gratitude for making her happy." They shook hands, and Mason felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not even known he was carrying. Over the next 2 months, Mason and Bonnie made plans. They pored over maps and newspapers, looking for affordable land near a town that would need a horse trainer. They found it in a valley about 20 miles south of Miles City, near a small settlement called Rosebud Creek. A widow there was selling her late husband's property. 10 acres with a small house, a barn, and a corral. The price was steep, $500, but the location was perfect, near enough to Miles City to attract customers but far enough away to have room to grow. With Mason's savings, Bonnie's inheritance from Henry, and a small loan from the bank, they could afford it. Barely. They would have almost nothing left over for supplies or animals, but it was a start. On the day the ranch sold, Henry and Thomas left for Wyoming. The goodbye was bittersweet. Bonnie held her nephew for a long time, tears streaming down her face. "I love you so much, little one," she whispered. "You will always be a part of me, a part of your mother. Do not ever forget her." "We will write," Henry promised, hugging Bonnie tightly. "And you will visit." "Mason, you take care of her, make her happy." "I will do my best," Mason promised. The new ranch owner did not keep Mason on. He had his own crew from Texas, men he had worked with for years. But it did not matter anymore. Mason and Bonnie had their own plan now. They moved into the small house near Rosebud Creek in early May of 1885. It was not much, just 4 rooms and a loft, but it was theirs. The first night they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over their land, and Bonnie leaned her head on Mason's shoulder. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Terrified," Mason admitted. "We have spent almost all our money on this place. If I cannot make this work, if I cannot get enough clients to support us, we will lose everything." "Then we will make it work," Bonnie said firmly. "Together." The next day they got to work. Mason started by fixing up the barn and corral, making them suitable for training horses. Bonnie planted a garden and started fixing up the house, making it a home. They lived frugally, buying only what they absolutely needed, eating simple meals, wearing clothes until they were patched beyond repair. Mason put out word that he was available for horse training, and slowly, clients started to come. First it was just one or two, ranchers who had heard about his work at Henry's place. But as those horses went back to their owners calm and responsive, more people came. Mason developed a reputation not just as a horse trainer, but as a horse whisperer, someone who could gentle the wildest animal with patience and understanding. By summer, they had enough income coming in that Mason felt comfortable asking the question he had been holding on to for almost a year. He proposed to Bonnie not with a fancy dinner or a dramatic gesture, but one evening as they were sitting on the porch after a long day of work. "Marry me," he said, turning to look at her. Bonnie blinked in surprise. "What? Marry me?" Mason repeated. "I know I should probably be on my knee, and I should have a ring, and I should make a pretty speech. But Bonnie, I have loved you since the day you trusted me enough to lean on me and walk 10 miles through the dark. I want to spend my life with you. I want to build this dream with you. Will you marry me?" Bonnie laughed and cried at the same time, which Mason was learning was something she did when she was overwhelmed with emotion. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course I will marry you, you ridiculous man." They were married in August, a small ceremony in the church in Miles City. There were no fancy clothes or elaborate decorations. Bonnie wore a simple blue dress that she had made herself, and Mason wore his best shirt and a new vest that Bonnie had given him. Jack Fletcher stood up as Mason's best man and Mrs. Davies, the former housekeeper from Henry's ranch, stood with Bonnie. Henry sent a telegram of congratulations from Wyoming and a gift of money that he insisted was a wedding present. After the ceremony, they went home to their little house and their 10 acres and began their life together as husband and wife. That life was not easy. There were lean times when clients were scarce and the money ran low. There were storms that damaged the barn and had to be repaired. There were disagreements and moments of doubt, but there was also joy, deep and abiding. There was the satisfaction of watching a troubled horse transform under Mason's care. There was the pride Bonnie felt in her garden, which grew larger and more productive each year. There were quiet evenings on the porch, talking about their days and their dreams. In the spring of 1886, Bonnie told Mason she was pregnant. He was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. What did he know about being a father? His own father had been a drunk who could barely take care of himself, let alone a family. But Bonnie was confident, and her confidence bolstered his. Their son was born in December, a healthy boy with his mother's blue eyes and his father's dark hair. They named him Benjamin after Mason's maternal grandfather, the only family member Mason remembered with any fondness. Ben, as they called him, was a happy baby who loved watching his father work with the horses. As soon as he could walk, he was toddling around the corral, fearless and curious. The years passed, each one bringing new challenges and new growth. Mason's reputation continued to grow, and he was able to raise his rates, bringing in more money. They expanded the stable, built a second corral, and bought their first breeding mare. Bonnie started selling her garden produce and baked goods in town, adding to their income. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. In 1888, they had a daughter, Sarah, named for Bonnie's mother. She was quieter than Ben, more thoughtful, with her mother's quick mind and her father's patience. Bonnie taught both children to read and write, turning their home into a one-room schoolhouse on rainy days when they could not be outside. Mason never forgot where he had come from. He never forgot the sound of Bonnie's crying that had made him turn back on that dusty road, or the 6 years he had spent in prison learning hard lessons about choices and consequences. He used those memories to make himself a better man, a better husband, a better father. Sometimes, late at night when he could not sleep, Mason would walk outside and look up at the Montana sky, so vast and full of stars. He would think about the path that had led him here, about the terrible choices and the unexpected grace, about the woman who had trusted him when she had no reason to, and about the life they had built together from nothing. Bonnie often joined him on those nights, slipping her hand into his as naturally as breathing. "What are you thinking about?" she would ask. "Just counting my blessings," Mason would reply. And he would pull her close, grateful for every moment, every second chance, every bit of happiness he had found in the wreckage of his past. In 1890, they received a letter from Henry in Wyoming. He was remarrying, a widow with 2 children of her own. Thomas, now 6 years old, was excited to have siblings. Henry wrote that he was finally ready to move forward, that he would always love Beth, but that he had learned he could honor her memory while still embracing life. He thanked Mason and Bonnie for showing him what that looked like. That same year, Mason made enough profit to finally pay off the bank loan that had helped them buy their property. The day he made the final payment, he came home and swept Bonnie up in his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "We did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This place is ours, really ours. No one can take it from us." "We did it," Bonnie agreed, cupping his face in her hands. "And we are going to keep doing it, building this life, this family, this dream." By 1892, O'Brien horse training was known throughout the region. Ranchers came from as far as North Dakota and Wyoming to have Mason work with their animals. He hired 2 assistants, young men who wanted to learn his methods, and the operation expanded again. They bought more land, increasing their property to 30 acres. They built a bigger house with separate rooms for the children and a real kitchen for Bonnie. But it was never the wealth or the success that mattered most to Mason. It was the moments in between. It was Ben coming to him with questions about the horses, absorbing everything Mason taught him with eager intensity. It was Sarah falling asleep in his arms after he read her a story. It was Bonnie sitting beside him at the dinner table, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed food, the simple intimacy of 2 people who knew each other completely. It was the life they had built, not from privilege or good fortune, but from hard work and determination and love that refused to give up even when things were difficult. In the summer of 1894, 10 years after Mason had heard Bonnie crying and turned back, they stood together at Beth's grave in Miles City. It was the first time Bonnie had been back since the funeral. She had needed those years to heal, to be able to face the grief without being consumed by it. "Thank you for bringing me here," Bonnie said, laying flowers on her twin sister's grave. "I needed to tell her about my life, about our children, about how happy I am. I needed her to know that I am all right, that I survived losing her." "She would be proud of you," Mason said, his arm around Bonnie's waist. "She would be grateful to you," Bonnie replied. "For saving me, for loving me, for giving me a reason to keep living when I did not think I could." As they walked away from the cemetery, heading back to the wagon where Ben and Sarah were waiting, Mason thought about that night 10 years ago. He thought about the fork in the road, the choice he had almost not made. What if he had kept walking? What if he had decided that someone else's trouble was not his concern? He would have missed all of this. The love, the family, the home, the purpose. He would have missed the best parts of his life. "What are you thinking?" Bonnie asked, reading the expression on his face. "I am thinking that turning back was the best decision I ever made," Mason said. Bonnie smiled, that radiant smile that still made his heart skip after all these years. "For both of us." The years continued to unfold. Ben grew into a fine young man, taking over more and more of the horse training as Mason's knees started to protest the long hours in the corral. Sarah developed a love for teaching, working with the children of ranch hands and homesteaders who settled near Rosebud Creek. In 1898, they welcomed a third child, a surprise baby boy they named Henry, after the man who had given Mason his first second chance. Mason was 42 by then, graying at the temples, his face weathered by years of sun and wind. But he was content in a way he had never imagined possible when he was younger. He had built something lasting, something good. He had turned his life around not through grand gestures but through daily choices to be better, to do better, to love better. Bonnie, at 37, was still the most beautiful woman Mason had ever seen. The years had added fine lines around her eyes and threads of silver to her honey-colored hair, but to Mason, she was perfect. She was his partner in every sense of the word, working beside him to build their life, raising their children, facing challenges with the same courage she had shown that night in the ravine when her world had fallen apart. On summer evenings, when the work was done and the children were playing in the yard, Mason and Bonnie still sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant colors. They would talk about their day, make plans for tomorrow, or simply sit in comfortable silence, hands intertwined. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had kept walking that night?" Bonnie asked him once, years after the question had any real weight. "Never," Mason said immediately, "because this is the life I was meant to live, with you. Everything before that was just the journey to get here." "You always know the right thing to say," Bonnie teased, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I have had a good teacher," Mason replied, kissing the top of her head. In the early 1900s, as the new century began, their operation continued to thrive. Ben married a sweet girl from Miles City, a rancher's daughter named Emma, and they built a house on the northern corner of the property. They gave Mason and Bonnie their first grandchild, a granddaughter named Beth, and Mason watched Bonnie cry happy tears as she held the baby named after her twin sister. "She would have loved this," Bonnie whispered. "She would have loved seeing our family grow, seeing how happy we are." "I think she knows," Mason said. "Somehow, I think she knows." Sarah became engaged to a young schoolteacher from Billings, and they planned to marry in the spring. Henry, the youngest, was showing the same gift for horses that his father had, spending every free moment in the corral, learning, watching, practicing. Mason was 53 in 1905, and he finally allowed himself to step back from the daily operation of the business. Ben had taken over most of the training work, and they had 3 full-time employees now. Mason still consulted on difficult cases, still loved working with the horses, but he no longer needed to be there from dawn until dusk. He spent more time with Bonnie, helping in her now extensive gardens, reading together in the evenings, taking long walks around their property. They traveled occasionally, visiting Henry in Wyoming, where Thomas had grown into a fine young man with his own family. They went to California once, trying to find Mason's sister, but the trail had gone cold years ago. It saddened Mason, but he had learned to accept that some losses were permanent. One evening in the fall of 1907, 23 years after they had first met, Mason and Bonnie sat on their porch, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Ben and Emma's family had grown to 3 children now, and they lived and worked on the property alongside Mason and Bonnie. Sarah and her husband visited often with their 2 boys. Henry, at 19, was courting a girl from town, and wedding bells seemed likely in the near future. "We built something good, did not we?" Bonnie said, a statement more than a question. "We built something extraordinary," Mason corrected. "You built something extraordinary. I was just the broken man you put back together." Bonnie laughed at that. "You were never broken, Mason O'Brien. Bent maybe, tested certainly, but never broken. You had strength in you that you did not even know about. You just needed a reason to use it." "You were my reason," Mason said simply. "That night when I heard you crying when I turned back, I was not thinking about building a life or finding love or becoming a better man. I just could not stand the thought of someone suffering alone when I could help. But you gave me all those things anyway. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Bonnie said, taking his hand. "That is how love works, Mason. It is not one person saving another. It is 2 people choosing each other every day through everything life throws at them." They sat there as the sun set, as they had done thousands of times before, and Mason reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought him here. From a prison cell to this porch, from a man with nothing to a man with everything that mattered. All because he had heard a woman crying and decided to turn back. "I love you," he told Bonnie, words he had said countless times but never tired of saying. "I love you too," she replied, words that never lost their power no matter how often she spoke them. The stars came out, brilliant against the darkening sky, and in the distance, they could hear the sounds of their family, their legacy, continuing on. The horses nickered in their stalls, content and well cared for. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, the same kind of trees that had sheltered Bonnie on the worst night of her life. But that night had also been the beginning of something beautiful, something lasting, something worth all the pain that had come before. Mason O'Brien had walked out of prison a free man for the first time in years, with no idea what his future held. He had been broken by his mistakes, shaped by his suffering, and uncertain of his worth. But when he turned back toward the sound of crying, he had unknowingly set himself on a path toward redemption, toward love, toward a life richer and fuller than he had ever dreamed possible. And as he sat on that porch with Bonnie beside him, their hands clasped together, their family thriving around them, Mason knew with absolute certainty that he would make that same choice again. Every single time, because turning back had not just saved Bonnie's life that night. It had saved his own, the life they built together, from that moment of compassion in the Montana wilderness, stood as proof that second chances were real, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the best things in life came from the choices we almost did not make. Their love story was not one of grand romantic gestures or sweeping declarations. It was quieter than that, built on daily acts of kindness, on choosing each other through hardship, on building a life one moment at a time. As the years continued to pass, and Mason and Bonnie grew old together, surrounded by children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren, their story became part of family legend. The tale of how a cowboy fresh out of prison heard a woman crying and turned back, how that single act of compassion had changed 2 lives and created a legacy that would continue for generations. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth living. And every time Mason looked at Bonnie, even decades later when they were both silver-haired and moving slower, he felt the same surge of gratitude and love that he had felt that first night. She had trusted him when she had no reason to. She had chosen him when he had nothing to offer. She had built a life with him, dream by dream, day by day, and he had spent every day since trying to be worthy of that trust, that choice, that love. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. because she had given him something more precious than freedom or success or wealth. She had given him a reason to be better, and in doing so, had given him back himself. That was the real gift of their love story. Not the happy ending, though they certainly had that. Not the success of their business or the strength of their family, though those things mattered. The real gift was the transformation, the way two broken people had found each other in the darkness and chosen to walk toward the light together. The way a moment of compassion had blossomed into a lifetime of love. The way turning back had led them both home. And when Mason O'Brien finally passed away in 1925 at the age of 69, surrounded by the family he and Bonnie had created, his last words were for his wife. "Thank you," he whispered, his hand in hers one final time, "for letting me turn back." Bonnie held him as he slipped away, tears streaming down her face, but her heart was full. They had lived a good life together, a full life, a life built on love and hard work and choices that mattered. She missed him every day after that, but she never regretted a single moment they had shared. And when it was her turn to go, 11 years later in 1936, she went peacefully, knowing that she had lived and loved well, that the family she and Mason had built would carry on their legacy of compassion, of second chances, of turning back when someone needed help. Their story lived on in the family they created, in the business that continued to thrive under their children and grandchildren, in the little house near Rosebud Creek that became a landmark of perseverance and love. And most importantly, it lived on in the lesson they had taught by example, that it is never too late to change your path, that love can find you in the darkest moments, and that sometimes the most important decision you will ever make is the decision to turn back when you hear someone crying, to offer help when you have nothing, to choose love when fear would be easier. That was the legacy of Mason and Bonnie O'Brien. Not wealth or fame, but something far more valuable, a life well lived, a love that endured, and a reminder that second chances are always possible for those brave enough to take them.